we've seen the Horse's Head Nebula in Orion. And when you look at the night sky early in the year, the rising of Orion above the horizon just after sunset has, for long ages, signaled those of us who live in the northern temperate regions of this planet the beginning of winter. And so the constellation of Orion is one of the best known constellations in human history, and it indicates to us very clearly that the stars, that heaven itself is shaped, that heaven should have a shape. The term used universally now is constellation. A constellation is a gestalt that comes into shape by seeing. That the shape is not there in and of itself, but that the seeing of it helps cement the shape. So that a constellation, something that comes into constellation, depends upon our cooperation with the object. That the object is seen first in a disparate arrangement, and that the longer that we see, the more the disparateness changes into relationality, and that as we become capable of recognizing, the recognition cinches and seals the shape. And so a constellation like Orion is an early indication of the way in which the evolution and the history of our spiritual education has taken place. We know today that the 3 stars in the belt of Orion, those 3 very large stars, are about 900 light years away, and that the 2 most powerful stars, in the upper left hand is one of the most large, gorgeous stars in all of space, has the peculiar name of Betelgeuse. And Betelgeuse is a super yellow giant. If Betelgeuse were where our sun is, the surface of the star would be out around the orbit of Jupiter. So it's immense, enormous. And almost complementing Orion, complementing Betelgeuse, below the 3 stars is a super white giant named Rigel, almost as large as Betelgeuse, but intensely hot, so that its blue-white light is almost searing. When we see the bright star Sirius, which always indicated in Egypt and Samaria the beginning of the fertile season, the flowing of the Nile, the way in which the Indus and the Tigris would begin to fructify the land, even as far away as Europe, the early flow of nourishment in the spring, always signaled by the rising of Sirius, the dog star. Sirius is a blue-white giant, but only 7 light years away. Rigel, many, many, many times farther away, is almost as bright as Sirius. So that if we were in a star system around Sirius, we would have to be almost at the edge of comprehension to be able to stand the intensity of the energy coming from that star. Beings who would be able to live on planets in a star system with Sirius at its center would have to have adapted to a power of radiation that would be lethal to us many thousands of times over. And so we have learned that we live in a miraculous, magical show, and that what was at one time a universe is now seen by us as something that could be characterized as an omniverse, a much variated place. Instead of a universe having as its characteristic oneness, we live in a cosmos which has as its characteristic differentiation. And in this way, our education has two different cycles which take place at the same time, but we spread them out into a time linearity in order to give ourselves a comprehension. We're trying to learn how to learn. And after having gone through a 2-year linearity, a timeline development, we will see a shape similar to this old infinity sign, to this sign for the interpenetration of two cycles, one a cycle of integration and the second a cycle of differentiation. And what characterizes the integration is a universe, and what characterizes the differentiation is a cosmos. And the difference between them, the difference between a universe and a cosmos, is that the cosmos includes us. It includes our seeing. And the seeingness of our quality permeates the universe to such an extent that everything is transformed. And so a universe transforms itself into a cosmos by having been seen. And deeper, the old way of talking about it was not only was it seen, but it was named. The introduction of language into the universe percolates and distills, and to use a fancy term that would be used at Caltech, renormalizes something from what it is to what it can be. And in a way, the cosmos is everything that the universe can be, and it can be unlimited versions of itself. Now, on this scale of actuality, an education initially must take practical stock of the scope and scale that we are dealing with, and to also elicit from ourselves, to encourage to come out from our being the juices that are able to distill, to transform, to renormalize an entire universe into a cosmos. Now, this is the scale. We saw earlier the Horse's Head Nebula in Orion, and we talked about the constellation of Orion and how the Horse's Head Nebula looks like a dark chess piece emerging out of the background being these dense clouds of gas. And we know now that the horse's head in the nebula is a shape which we see as similar to a horse's head, a chess piece, a knight, but that it's actually a plume, a great plume of gas. And that this plume at 15 miles a second is a huge ball that's going to curl upon itself. And in large galactic ages, which are ever so much longer than glacial ages being hundreds of thousands or millions of years, galactic ages being billions of years. One can almost hear the great intonation of Carl Sagan saying billions and billions in the Cosmos series. That eventually the horse's head will curl upon itself, that this chess piece, this grand universal knight, will bow its head, and in bowing its head, its neck will flow over it, and it will become a ball. And in that motion, that dynamic, will so intensify the pressure in this gas that stars will be born. And where the horse's head is 1 billion years from now will be a constellation like the Pleiades. Many new young stars, as the great illustration of Blake in his Book of Job series, when the morning stars sang together. What do they sing? They sing an energy intensification, which is that integration brings the most peculiar qualities into existence. And we have seen so far that nature is characterized by a great movement that brings existence into actuality, that matter, materia, the very stuff, comes into being by a condensation, by an integration, by an intensification. And that what it was before was something more nebulous, like great gobs of gas, like clouds of dark, unilluminated atoms, and that these atoms themselves were particles, and that the universe has this very peculiar quality, that out of an enormous soup of subatomic particles, as the cooling took place from millions and millions of degrees Kelvin down into cooler ranges of just 1,000,000 degrees Kelvin, 100,000 degrees Kelvin, one gets condensations like a rain of particles. And out of this rain of particles, pools of atoms form. And the atoms in motion love each other with the bindingness that makes molecules. And once one has molecules, one has the building blocks of matter on the scale of minerals, metals, the stuff that we know of. But only by our knowing this, only by our saying, this is so, does a cosmos come into being. For a cosmos is not there in stuff. It's not there in the atoms, the molecules, the dust clouds, or even the stars. It is there in the composition, the infinite relationalities which are introduced and cinched and made there by our being willing co-creators in this universe. And that differential quality resonates out from us and actually transforms everything that we can see, everything that we can name, and includes us. It includes us in the sense that in every ratio in the cosmos, our participation is like the line that relates common nominator and denominators and numerators and brings them together. And wherever there's a ratio, even a ratio of wholeness, for one can write 1 as 1 over 1. And when one is able to write 1 over 1 equals 1, a great capacity of differential quality has come into play. Once 1 can be written and spoken and recognized and seen and thought and said to be 1 over 1, the 1 over 1 can change so that the 1 over 1 can become 1 over 2, and you can have a half. And that is a monumental step in the energies of possibility. And we've seen that nature, in and of itself, even before it becomes a cosmos, even before we participate, nature has possibilities that are unlimited. And the possibilities occur because exact identity is so rare as to be almost non-existent, while very close similarities is so common as to be almost unnoticed. And we have seen that nature is much more accessible, more visible, more interesting. We need a wider variety of names. When we set aside the need, the habit, the absolute requirement that identity be a measuring caliper for nature, and relearn, or perhaps learn again for the first time, that similarity will do. And setting aside 1 over 1 equals 1 as an identity, that the equals sign is not so much a positing of absoluteness, but a designation of relationality. And that relationality characterizes nature to such an extent that it survives. The relationality of integration survives even the vanishing in upon itself, and reemerges on the other side of vanishing as a differential quality. That integration pulls in to a vanishing point and reappears out of the vanishing as an ever-opening infinity. Now, this quality of nature, this ability for our ancestors, for our progenitors to see, to name, to understand, to participate with, this enormous ecology, characterized not so much by an objective identity, but characterized by a phase-form development. Not just an evolution, but also a devolution, but also a transformation. An ecology which has various phases too. And we began our education 2 months ago by taking a lesson for ourselves, taking a vocabulary for ourselves, taking a way to understand a constellation of phase form development. We took that lesson, that possibility for calibration from the ancient Chinese. And we began the education with the I Ching on one hand and with Henry David Thoreau on the other. We took someone who was at home with surveying snowstorms in the winter among the trees, joining the trees, and we paired Thoreau with the I Ching, a place where very early on, about 5,000 years ago, men and women like ourselves learned to characterize the constellations of this universe, not just as shapes which one could see and identify, but as shapes which come into being, come into those gestalts and distill and change and become other constellations and perhaps return again and become what they were before. The I Ching characterized nature as a 5-phase energy cycle. And we saw that we could, just as Chinese 5,000 years ago, the very beginnings of their civilization, the beginnings of a transformation out of what the Chinese had been before into what the Chinese have increasingly become. Not the identity culturally of the Chinese, but the similarity of Chinese with each other so that they form a gestalt, which later can be named Chinese. They saw that the 5-phase energy cycle has, like this hand, 2 really important beginnings. It has a caliper, which is like the thumb and the forefinger. It's like the forefinger that can point at something and say that. It's like the thumb that opposes the fingers and is able to give grasp, but in and of itself, the Chinese characterized that as Tao. And we saw that in our designation, in the characterization of Tao, what in our language, in our way of saying, in our way of seeing, Tao is a 0. Not a 0 as in nothing, but a 0 as in 0 base. And that if we begin with a 0 base, 1 has a very interesting quality. 1 emerges instantaneously, spontaneously out of 0, but carries with it all of the integrity of 0 with it. So that 1, rather than being different from 0 in terms of identity, 1 is related to 0 in terms of similarity. 0 and 1 have a similarity. They are completely and totally what they are, so that 1 has a oneness and 0 has a zeroness. And their relationality is that the ness of the 0 and the ness of the 1 fit. So that 1 and 0, oneness and zeroness, form a complementarity, as we would say today. They form a complementarity which is very fertile, capable, and when 1 has a 1 and a 0 as designations, 1 can build the entire realm of computer language. It's all based on that. 1 has a binary code. 1 has a way of using a fundamental structure of language which is truthful. Not truthful in the sense that what it identifies is there, but that something deeper, that the whole process of use cinches and holds whenever it's used, whenever it works. That its efficacy is not based upon identity, but on the relationalities. What is brought into play and thus into being. And we have seen that ancient peoples, the whole planet round, characterized nature as something which was alive and emergent. The Greek term that someone is cut and dried, supposedly as Aristotle used for nature, physis, literally means becoming. The very first word that Moses used in the Pentateuch, the very first word of Genesis, Bereshith, is a gerund. It means literally beginning. It means that this becoming, this beginning, is an ongoingness, and what gives it amperage, what gives it oomph, is that what is becoming, what is beginning, is oneness in dance, concert, choreographed by anyone who dances with it, of 1 dancing with 0. That somehow there's a syncopation between zeroness and oneness. And in this syncopation, a rhythmic structure is set up in the universe that allows for thusness to move in a pair of ways. that oneness, thusness, moves as an undulating wave of energy, and that at any point of touch or impact or interpenetration, two energy waves, when they intersect, when they touch, one can have an intersection of waves or a point, a particle. That one could say that light, let there be light. Light moves as an energy wave, but it also is a particle, a stream of particles, photons. Whenever one finds a visual focus, one could focus on a single photon. One could, in fact, spectrographs in observatories around the world record photons from a star or any heavenly body, and each photon that records carries with it the entire star, the entire galaxy. That one of the great mysteries that's there in nature is that nature, because it has zeroness and one, because the oneness comes out of zero, it has the ness, that in reality, in actuality, in the mystery of truthful practicality, any particle of something carries all of it with it. One could analyze a single photon from Rigel and learn what the structure of Rigel was from that single photon. Now we know in 1990s mathematical astrophysics that this is the principle of the soliton. A soliton is like a bell-shaped donut that every time it is struck, the vibration of that bell-shaped donut is in every part a bell-shaped donut. Not only does the wholeness ring, every vibration of it is wholeness. And that one never can slice a part away from the wholeness. So that nature is characterized down to and below its diapers in the infant nudity of the universe. One exists and relates to zero. And we saw that the Chinese, 5,000 years ago, calling zero Tao and calling one Te, learned that there was this syncopation between Tao and Te, and that somehow we occupy a recognition, a knowing line that relates the zero and the one. So that in this ancient ratio of the people that became the Chinese, 1 over 0, or 0 over 1, included us as the line relatedly linking together numerator and denominator. That wherever there was a ratio, we were the line. We were that balance middle. And so the Chinese word 5,000 years ago for us was Zhen, and while it literally means human-heartedness, it means that whatever it is that we are is introduced in every soliton aspect of our vibration. That whatever is really the heart, soul, core of us is there in every instance of our doing, of our knowing, of our saying, and that somehow the universe had Tao, Te, Zhen. It had this triad, this trilogy, this triumvirate and that we were included as a resolving third. We're as the alchemical statement was, both in the ancient West and in the ancient China. Both developed the same alchemical term, that wherever there is a polarity, a resolving third transforms the polarity back into its realistic complementarity. And being dissolved back out of polarity into complementarity, one can re-precipitate a new constellation, a new form, a new shape, back out of that solution, back into existence again. And so the most ancient wisdom was always that nature teaches us how we are, that in existence we can trust that polarity will hold, but that by bringing ourselves into play with existence on its own level and energizing ourselves so that we participate completely with the polarity of existence, we make a resolving third where the polarities are able to come back into play as complementarities, where 0 and 1 play again, dance again. And so Jin, the resolving third, that quality of transformation is also a part of nature. And it is the farthest reach of nature, so that we are like a liminal surface of the truth of the universe. We are the farthest reach of nature, and that the waves of the natural universe find a beach in our ability to have relationality and to say it, to know it, to designate it, and to make use. And for the Chinese 5,000 years ago, this point of realization, what we're talking about now, what we're listening to now, was recognized as having existence on equal basis. That just as existence in Te is very firm, 1 coming out of 0, so that the 1 is quite real, something comes out of the third level, the third phase of that 5-phase energy cycle. Tao is in the first phase, and out of it comes the objectivity of Te. Zhen is in the third phase, and something else comes out of and is objective. One can say that that fourth phase, the Chinese word for it is simply Yi. It means change, like in I Ching, Book of Changes. It means change, but it refers to the objectivity of the mind, that changes take place, and that somehow our mind becomes objective in this kind of change. And so the ancient Chinese, as well as the ancient West, recognized that the very first objectivity in the universe is the body, but that there is a second level, a second order of objectivity, which is the mind. And that the mind, rather than just being something that was vacuous and nothing in and of itself, is actually very objective. That the mind is as objective as the body. And so body and mind are like a pair. They're like a tandem. And their pairedness is held by the certainty, by the bank account of another pair, Tao and Zhen. That as long as Tao is 0, 1, the body, existence, will be real. will maintain itself even though it has a polarized provisionality, that all existence is really provisional. Polarity, it means provisional. It's polarized and it's here now as long as the polarity holds. If the polarity does not hold, then what is guaranteed by that polarity? That structure will collapse. It will dissolve. It will go back to what it was, or it will move ahead and be what it can become. That existence is provisional, that the body is provisional. It's temporary in the sense that as long as the polarity that structures the shape holds, that body will be there. But that the body is not meant to be permanent, but provisional. And the Chinese, 5,000 years ago, already were able to say, and to write down, and to mean it, that the mind was a similar provisional extant. That the mind, yes, exists, is objective, but is also provisional. Does not have an identity which stays and stays and stays, but has, in consonance with nature, a quality like the body of staying as long as the polarity that sustains it is there, and then it moves on. And so the great question 5,000 years ago, what was there in the fifth phase? What does it move on to? What does the mind move on to? And the clue was in this equanimity of Jen, in the balance of our human-heartedness, in that third phase. That third phase, they could see balanced Tao and Te on one side and E and something else on the other side. That our Jen was like a fulcrum that balanced something. It balanced Tao and Te over here. It balanced the mind, E, and something else. Well, what else was there? Just as Te, the body, is balanced by E on Jen, something balances Tao. What balances Tao? The Chinese named heaven, earth. It literally means the 10,000 things. It means this world. This world is pair with Tao, just as the body is a pair with the mind. The body and the mind fit together because they're in the same family. The mind is a higher order member of that family, but nevertheless in the same family, the family of polarities that are provisional. The world, heaven, earth, the 10,000 things, multiplicity is what we would call it today. That multiplicity balances zeroness. Not the zero of nothing, but the zeroness of Tao. So that nature, the world, is able to be reabsorbed by Tao without leaving anything left over, without leaving a trace. And so the five-phase energy cycle was seen as an ecology, as a circle. And that this world, mysteriously, flows back into Tao. The term in English is returns. And so, in the Tao Te Ching, in my translation of it, the 45th chapter, called Grand Te, reads like this, and then we'll take a break. Great perfection seems imperfect, its function not worn out. Great completion seems empty, its function not exhausted. Great straightness seems curving. Great skill seems peculiar. Great eloquence seems hesitant. Motion displaces cold inertia. Quiet displaces the fevered. Purity, cleanness are this world's calibration. Take a break. This scroll is a Chinese landscape scroll, and it presents the waves of energy as mountain ranges. And there are 3 here. So that this wave front, this energy flow, is mountains and rivers. At the apex of the energy sine wave are mountains, and at the trough of the energy sine wave are rivers. And so the Chinese saying is mountains and rivers without end. It means that the energy of nature is without end. It's ongoing. That it comes out of Tao and comes into multiplicity eventually through this 5-phase energy cycle and returns back into Tao. When the only major idea before science of the 20th century West was introduced to China, the only major idea that the Chinese accepted from other people was the idea of Buddhism, that energy in a being is capable of going through a complete cycle and vanishes into Tao again. And the Chinese understanding was that the Dharma chakra, when it is turned, spins back into shunyata. And it was the only idea taken from India, in this instance, that the Chinese ever accepted from other people. And they accepted it in such a way that eventually it became Sinicized, Chinesized. And by the early Tang dynasty, it was completely absorbed into China. The ancient Chinese understood Tao, Te, Zhen as the working triangle, the working triad. But by the time of the great classical era of Chinese thought, the age of Confucius, the age of Lao Tzu and Confucius, Mozi, many other philosophers, all lived about the same time, like the great period in, say, Greek philosophy, where Plato, Socrates, Aristotle all lived at the same time. In the time of Confucius, about 500 BC, a great change took place. And most of the bulk of the I Ching was written by Confucius. Now, many Westerners like to say that Confucius is like Aristotle and Taoism is like Plato, that somehow there's this polarity, that one is very cut and dried, logical presentation, the other is kind of fluid, mysterious, liberal presentation. Most of the great Taoist classic, the I Ching, was written by Confucius. And so most of what's in the I Ching is shifted over so that it does not emphasize Tao, Te, Zhen as the formative triad, but starts with Zhen. Instead of starting with Tao, Confucius started with Zhen. Because for over 2,000 years, the Chinese had developed Tao, Te to Zhen. And so in Confucius' day, he assumed that everyone now understood Tao Te very well and how Zhen came to be. That man came to be the bridge between heaven and earth, the bridge between Tao and Te. And originally, the great saying, man is the bridge between heaven and earth, would have been translated as man is the great relationality between Tao and Te. That man as Zhen harmonizes Tao and Te. But in Confucius' day, the saying was changed. Instead of man harmonizing Tao and Te, now man became the bridge between heaven and earth, and Zhen became the beginning, and the other two cycles, E for the mind, and multiplicity, which had meant all the things of this world, now was derived from the mind. And the fifth phase, its designation, the word is Li. Li, instead of being like the ancient Chinese would have understood as the multiplicity that factors back into Tao, now Li was understood as the intellectual structure of the world and called principle. And so one of the Confucian classics in China is called the Li Qi. It's the book of rites, the book of rituals. And in translation, to fat volumes. So that the principles of ritual now was in the formative triad. So there's man, the mind, and the way things are done. Now this shift from 0 and 1 and the mystery of man to beginning with man and then the mind and then the way things are done, the principles of ritual, characterizes a whole new development in China, in Chinese civilization, and it occurred about the same time in the West. Classical Greece is like Confucianism in that it begins with man as the measure of all things. That nature, whatever nature is going to be, nature is the way things happen, the way things are done, and we are like a calibrating arbiter of the way things are done. And that whether man is empowered by the gods to do this, or whether he seizes the day, carpe diem, all comes to the same thing. So when you read Confucius' little book, it's called the Lun Yu, the Analects of Confucius, the wise sayings of Confucius. Everywhere in the Analects of Confucius one finds the term Zhen. You almost never find the term Tao, and you never find Te. The Chinese assumed Tao and Te and began with Zhen from 500 BC on. And one finds in Chinese history, when you look at that era, in retrospect, it's called the period of warring states. It's still a part of the Zhou dynasty. An alternate name for the I Ching is the Zhou Yi, the mind of Zhou, the Zhou dynasty. Because the Zhou dynasty, when it began with King Wen and his brother, the Duke of Zhou, the men and women of Zhou were seen as a bright new era in human beings. And the I Ching was the great document, the constitution of understanding man's place in magical nature. But by Confucius' day, it already had declined and needed to be revivified, and Confucius is the revivifier. He's the one who says we have to brush up and brighten up, we have to add commentaries and represent this so that new men and women, new generations can understand what this is because they no longer live familiarly in a universe where Tao Te are mysteriously there. But they live in a man-made world where they have to be reminded, and they're reminded not by Tao Te, but by introducing them to the balance of Tao Te, which is the mind, Yi, and Li, the principles. So it's up to civilization to present man and his mind and the principles by which things get done. This is the new triad. This is the new basis. And yes, Tao and Te are there, but they're subsumed in this. And on someone on the level of Confucius, indeed, they're subsumed. They're all there. But later, especially men studying the I Ching as an exam text to pass the state civil service exams, introduced about 300 years after Confucius, they didn't take the time to feel the mystery of Tao or to appreciate the existence of Te. They were too busy trying to learn how to pass the exam to get into a pecking order of authority and power. And so the Chinese, from the time of the introduction of the civil service exam, which came in about 200 BC and lasted until 1911 AD, with an unbroken batting order. No new lineup cards were introduced at all. Who's pitching today? The Confucian classics. Who's pitching tomorrow? You guessed it. For over 2,000 years, the same lineup card. Now this, assuming that nature is appreciated and understood, is fine when man is natural. But when man starts with himself and doesn't know about the real of zero base, doesn't have an ability to absorb the oomph of existence uncut. Thoreau said in one of his journals, "In wilderness is the preservation of man." The wilderness of existence, not as something which is junky and unkempt, but which is full and whole. The wildness of nature, untampered with, uncut. And though it can be written 1 or 1 over 1, it can also be written 1 trillion over 1 trillion. And man as the ratio of 1 trillion over 1 trillion, or 1 quadrillion over 1 quadrillion. Nature can be on any scale of complexity, any degree of orders. But when you start with man and just assume and subsume that this is understood, that this is appreciated, when an education overlooks the need to include this, especially at all the beginnings, at all the emergings, and those beginnings and those emergings are absolutely necessary. If you start counting with man, you miss the 0 and you miss the 1. You miss understanding and including consciously in your learning, in your education, the 0-ness and the 1-ness. And you begin with the third phase, which is 2. And when you begin with 2, without remembering 0-ness and 1-ness, 2 very easily slips into duality. And when you begin with duality, you've lost all the charm of the binary magic of nature. And you have people who mature not on the basis of education, but people who compete on the basis of instruction. And on that basis, the best teacher looks like the greatest sophist of Plato's day, Protagoras. Protagoras was well-dressed, he was famous, he was rich, he had all the students imaginable. And when he met Socrates, Plato was just 27 years old when it happened, and he remembered it. When he wrote his dialogue, Protagoras, he put the pith of that meeting. Protagoras had all the front men. Athens was agog. Protagoras is in town. Protagoras who says, man is the measure of all things. And what you need to know is how to persuade men to do what you would like them to do. This is 2,000 years before Machiavelli. He said, my teaching teaches you the art of rhetoric, because when you understand how to fine-tune language, which is the structure of persuasion, you can make happen anything that you want to make happen. And isn't that wonderful? And all you have to do to learn this is to queue up and pay my fee, and I'll turn you loose with energy. The same thing happened the world round. At that time, it was like an energy wave, where it was like in a trough, only the river that came out was the river of Spiel. And whoever had the fastest glistening spiel, oh, that guy. Oh, yes. It's been the same ever since. Now this education is not an instruction. It's an appreciation. It's an acceptance, finally, of the penetration of the way in which a constellation occurs. When we look long enough with nature, we begin to notice that the constellations that occur are everywhere. And that those constellations form some kind of an interpenetrating web or a pattern, a quality of wholeness which includes us, includes our knowingness, includes our doingness. When oneness was appreciated for what it was not seen to be stuff, but it was seen to be action. That doing characterized existence. Not stuff, but the ongoingness of what happens with stuff. That the motion, the dynamic, and in the Greek, because they were very distinct, though they were always somewhat together, the motion which has energy was called energeia. I guess that's why we have the word energy. The Greek word energeia. And along with it was the Greek word dynamis, from which we get, you guessed it, dynamic. That both have to do with action, and that energy, energeia, and dynamic, dynamis, are qualities that are there with doing. And while dynamic is this kind of motion that spins and curls, energy is that current, that amperage that gives it the oomph. Later on in our education, a year and a half from now, when we go into history, one of the very first things we'll do is have a pair of books. We'll have Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, And we'll have Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. And at the very core of Thucydides, one of the very first historians in the whole world, he talks about the dynamis of the people of Athens and how it bugged the energeia of the rest of the Greek world. That the Athenians had too much dynamis, and it was starting to squeeze out the energy of everyone else, and that's why they fought. And we'll see that Benjamin Franklin, who tapped the energy of the universe, put his own house key, on the end of a wire and flew that kite there in the thunderstorm. And Benjamin Franklin, who learned that lightning is electricity, that there's a universal fluid, an energy, that always has to be factored into the dynamic, that if the energy of the universe is factored into the dynamic of human life, that somehow existence on the level of Te and man on the level of Gen recapture the zero Tao, bring it back into play in such a way that the mind of man is changed. That when the mind of man is educated to include 0 and 1 as well as oneself, in that the mind has a kind of a fruitful fertility, an agility, an openness. And Benjamin Franklin, when he died in 1790, honored old Dr. Franklin. One of his last visitors was Thomas Jefferson, fresh back from 5 years in France. And one of the things that was brought to Dr. Franklin by Jefferson was the Herschel catalog of stars. The first edition had come out in 1786 and had 1,000 celestial objects. And very quickly in 1789, a second edition with another 1,000. So this big 2,000 item star catalog brought back. And the old man who had touched lightning with his own house key realized indeed that the age of enlightenment had reached a new maturity. And that what was needed was a new social form to hold energized man, energized by the mystery of nature all again, energized by the magicality of existence all again. And that the mystery of 0 and the magic of 1 had to be worked back into man's nature in a new educational way, so as to let a new mind flower. I think it's not exactly recorded, but I think Dr. Franklin said something to Jefferson. I think he said, "We're counting on you very much." Because after that, Jefferson, for the rest of his long life, never gave up trying to encourage the nourishment of a new mind. When he became president in 1800, Jefferson walked into the office with a very simple, basic idea. There have been in human history occasionally men and women who were free, and communities of men and women who were free, but there's never been a wide open landscape holding millions of men and women who can be whatever they need to be. And Jefferson had 6 presidencies, 2 of his own, 2 of his best pal Madison, and 2 of his next best pal Monroe. And after Jefferson's 6 presidencies, the United States was such a mysterious, magical place that whole era is called the era of good feeling in American history, where anything was possible because man was fresh and new, because he had been factored back into the wilderness in such a way that he could go and not leave a trace, that there were such things as European ancestored Indians who were at home in the wilderness, who could move like Pathfinder or Hawkeye and just leave, as Tolkien once wrote in his great epic Lord of the Rings, that hobbits could move like a whisper in the grass. There are qualities to education on the verge of the 21st century that need to be cosmos-wide. We need boys and girls who are going to be able to look out in their lives and go with whatever level of energy, with whatever complexity of dynamic they're capable of. They have to be turned loose. And the old feudal orders of medieval instruction are terrible shackle to put on these beautiful little winged beings. They need to be set free, because the stars make constellations that we haven't even begun to name. There are stars by the trillions and constellations by the quadrillions in galactic structures that have not even been seen yet. This whole quality of nature that we're appreciating, not even exploring yet. Our education doesn't have time to really explore so much, but our appreciation opens up, starts the juices where one could explore. And that's what this education is for, to open up. Most of you who are here were alive in 1959, and that's the year that the Hubble Atlas of Galaxies was published by the Carnegie Institute. And Edwin Hubble, who right here in Los Angeles was the first person to ever get the constellation of galaxies right. That most of the stars that we see in the sky are part of one whirling phenomenon, the Milky Way galaxy. And that there were galaxies other than ours, without number, to such an extent that Hubble said, galaxies are the atoms of the universe. There are so many of them, so vast, that the very stuff on the scale of billions of light years, the very solidity of stuff is made up of atoms of galaxies. Hubble worked from 1919 to 1948, patiently night after night, up above Pasadena, looking through the 100-inch telescope, making photographic plates, and collecting for 30 years those photographic plates to put together this Atlas of Galaxies. It was like the first great map that Mercator did in the Renaissance, showing the world as it was in the proportions that it really had. And being able to take a spherical globe and put it in a Mercator projection on a two-dimensional surface. And once one had that ability to have an atlas of the Earth in that form, you could navigate anywhere on the planet. Because you could renormalize, you could reinterpret, you could bring back off the flat page the spherical dimensions. Out of the geometry of the page, one could bring the trigonometry of the planet back into play in a mind that was wide enough and wild enough to do so. And Hubble wanted to put the universe on a two-dimensional atlas so that a wild, free, new kind of mind could reconstitute the incredibly dimensioned trigonometry of the cosmos. He died in 1953. The project was reassumed by the Carnegie Foundation. And Alan Sandage, who's still alive, who donated that beautiful whirling galaxy that we used the last time that we videoed this education. That was photograph was a gift of Sandage to the class. Sandage did the Hubble Atlas of Galaxies in 1959. And it was just 16 years later that one of our texts that we're using now, Galaxies, was published. So from the time of the Hubble Atlas of Galaxies in only 16 years, Galaxies, one of our textbooks, was published not by the Carnegie Foundation, but by the Sierra Club, by the John Muir people in San Francisco. Why? Because John Muir, just like Thoreau, understood that in wilderness is the preservation of our magical, mysterious ratio of the real. Man ratios the real when he is mysterious and magical, and with his fertile mind entertains the dance and play of possibility. When similarity is the taste that he uses to explore, instead of identity as the ruler which wraps the knuckles of those who will not pay attention. There is a great difference in this. When Muir was a young man in what is now Yosemite National Park, he was camping out on the floor of the valley, and his campmate was the aged Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Emerson and Muir were so ecstatic to be able to talk about how the old transcendentalists had a generation that included people like Muir that were preserving the actuality of a transcendental nature which was right there. But Muir wrote in his notebooks that it was the loneliest night of his entire life because, alas, the comrades traveling with Emerson said he was too old to sleep out that night and had to go inside of a structure. And so there was Muir sleeping under the stars in Yosemite Valley, curtained off from the great Emerson, who was bundled up by his entourage, safe and warm inside. And Muir said it was a great travesty, for had they understood, both of them, they would have let him be out there. For had he have died under the stars, Emerson still would have been home. I think it was Emerson who wrote, "Hitch your wagon to a star," because that's the scale at which man can travel. That's the only possible scale available. The 21st century will be a great mystical century like the 14th. The little babies, the little boys and girls born now, are going to be mystical, magical geniuses. They do not deserve to be put into shoe boxes of staid other ages. They deserve to be barefoot and free. And that's what an education is for. Galaxies is not a textbook of ours. Galaxies is always, as every book that we use, paired with another book. The particle explosion is paired with Galaxies here at this very juncture of nature, just as we began with the pair that was the I Ching and the portable Thoreau. We always take a pair of books, and we use books because books, the Greek word for books, the Latin word is libros, but the Greek word is codex. And the codex, as a collection of pages brought together in signatures that are bound in covers, this is an archetypal form that was made about 2,000 years ago. The first person to use a book, a codex, was Cicero, the great Roman orator and lawyer. And Cicero used a codex as fast reference crib notes, and he was never defeated in courts of law, even in a time where the old Republican Rome was being brushed aside by new powered tyrants. I guess you know what happened to Cicero, don't you? When he was killed, they cut off his hands, and they nailed his hands to the podium in the Roman Senate to show them who was in power. Well, those are the hands that held the first book, the first codex. And that form indexed a new kind of mind, a kind of mind that did not have to read in a linear fashion, but a mind that could read freely throughout the entire constellation, the entire gestalt of the book. Because before the codex, books, so-called, were scrolls. And you had to unravel a scroll in order to read it. I think in the 60s it used to be called linearity, although it wasn't just straight linearity. The scroll was replaced by the book 2,000 years ago. And it's true in our time the book is going to be replaced. But what's coming to replace the book in no way is workable yet. And so we're using books. But instead of using books in the old way, we're using books in a new way. We're using them as pairs, always in paired tandem. So that we don't have a text, we have a balance. We have a ratio. Thoreau and the I Ching, the particle explosion and galaxies, and the next pair is going to be the culmination of nature, and we're going to have them for 4 weeks. We're going to have them for a month. We're going to be guests of two incredible human beings, one man and one woman. The woman is Jane Goodall, who spent the last 35 years living with chimpanzees. And her book is called Through a Window, 30 Years with Chimpanzees. And paired with Jane Goodall's Through a Window, we're going to have The Double Helix by James D. Watson. Watson, the glib kid who wanted to beat out the old professional Linus Pauling in finding the structure of DNA, who, in between ogling the British girls and bites of food being chomped down and stealing here a micrograph and there an idea, who nevertheless put together in a new way a constellation of mind that was completely astounded by the fact that pairedness goes as deep as existence, and that the helical structure of DNA was a double helix. And the old genius Linus Pauling, who is one of the most brilliant facile minds of our time, was still traditional enough to think it might be a single helix or a triple helix. It could be a double helix. Whereas Watson was the impetuous, magical, mysterious elf in disguise as this kind of boisterous, crass American kid who thought science was a game. The real James Watson was like an old, mysterious magician in the old alchemical tradition, understanding that the double helix was the ancient symbol, and this would work. It does work. It's the old Hermetic caduceus that has the double serpent wrapped around. It's the double column of nerve cores in the spinal column. It's a universal quality that, when you have a cross-section of it, looks like an infinity sign. That the infinity sign is a cross-section of the spinal column in terms of its neural arrangement. It's a cross-section of the way in which nature occurs. In reality, it's a cross-section of the Hermetic caduceus. It's a cross-section of the DNA strand. It's the way in which one understands that here, in one symbol, one has a structure of mind which is related to the way in which existence is not only real, but there. That the objectivity of existence is matched by the objectivity of symbols in the mind. That symbols in the mind are objectively real. They are not provisionally there any less than existence is provisionally there. And it's true that existence ultimately is provisional. And it's true that symbols are ultimately provisional. But symbols are as objectively real as the stuff of matter. And once a powerful symbol is realized in the mind, that symbol has as much reality in the universe as a proton. The life expectancy of a proton is 10 to the 32nd years. There's a lot of zeros. So that the ancient understanding and wisdom traditions was that when you bring an education to someone, to take care that one does it in the right way, because the mind which brings that realization into play becomes extant in the cosmos and doesn't erase. The man-made litter gets to be a stench after a while, but it can all be brought back into play in a higher order of structure, but only by an education which pays attention to that dimension, that scale. And that's what we're doing here. Now, when we look next week at Jane Goodall's chimpanzees and Watson's double helix, we're going to see a way in which that pair of books aligns itself, arranges itself with the pair of books like The Particle Explosion and Galaxies, and before that, the I Ching and Thoreau. So next week, the lecture will be about this alignment of three pairs. Now, when you have three pairs in a row like that, the total constellation of that are 6 items, a hexagon, a hexagram, a 6-part structure like a snowflake, like the structure of a honeycomb of honeybees. It's a universal structure of 2 triads that come together, though they came together in a pair of not triads, but 3 pairs. But now the 3 pairs can be seen as a pair of triads. So that there is a way of seeing 6 as 3 2s or 2 3s. And that there's an ambidextrousness to this, so that the ratio of ability, symbolically, of a 6-part structure, a hexagram in the I Ching, a hexagon in the natural world, the possibilities of ratios in a 6-part constellation have this ambidextrous that moves very freely between pairedness and triadedness. And when you have that kind of facility, it frequently runs the risk of ambiguity if you forget about the mystery of zero or the magic of oneness. But with a little education, the ambiguity can be reconstituted as ambidextrousness. And as soon as we are ambidextrous again, balance and equanimity are well within our range again. And instead of man being characterized by dividing lines, he becomes characterized by ratioed lines. And when one has a geometry of ratios, one opens up the entire possibility of a cosmos. An education must deliver this to its students. Now, behind the scenes, another pair of books characterizes the entire first year. Two journeys, the Odyssey or Moby Dick. One a masculine journey, one a feminine journey. Odysseus only makes it home to a woman's home by way of the phases of women. All of the movement in the Odyssey is feminine. All the movement in Moby Dick is masculine. Two different journeys, a pair of books again, making a substrate for the whole first year. Just as we have 6 books that form that hexagram in nature, we will do it 4 times during the first year. There'll be 24 pairs of books, with a substrate of 1 pair of books to hold them all together. And then the next year we'll do the same thing. We'll have 2 pairs of journeys holding 48 pairs, 48 books together in pairedness that are able to be seen also in triads. This kind of structure is always operative there in this education. We don't make a big thing out of it. We don't need to. But it's there for your introspection. So that later on, I think a man named Richard Gregg once wrote a book on Gandhi. He said Gandhi was a compass for civilization. That if you understood Gandhi, you could carry him like you could carry a compass, and you could find your way in civilization. This education is a compass of learning. It has all the numbers there and all the relationalities mathematically that you need. But the charm of it is not to learn those first, but simply to play with it. Because by way of play, we familiarize ourselves. We let the little 1-year-old jabber and gibberish because the larynx in the mouth are learning how to make words through play. So right now we're just playing. After nature, our next great movement will be into ritual. And in ritual, the number 1 symbol that will be operative will be the mask. And so we will make 2 masks. One is something which comes into us from the world, and the other will be a mask that comes out of us to the world. The first will be a mask of some food. We will make a mask of the spirit of some food that appeals to us. And the other will be a mask of a feeling, some feeling that is characteristic of us. And by putting faces on food and feeling, and then bringing them together as a pair, it will energize the dynamic of our study of ritual, which will take about 3 months to go through, but will give it a substrate on the seasonal level that by the end of ritual, when we do a ceremony together by incorporating all these masks together, whatever the ceremony will be, we don't know. It depends on what the masks are, and they're not yet made. By having this creative kind of constellation, we will be ready by the end of the first half of the first year for crossing the threshold into language. And when we cross the threshold into language, a whole new quality of nature, of ritual, will appear. I used to say, when I first started teaching, that language flames out of ordered action in such a way that we are surprised that what we say holds. This is the way myth occurs in man. We tell ourselves stories that turn out to be true in ways which we are wondering, how could this be? How did we know that? And we discover at some mysterious magical point that it was true because we said it that way. Wallace Stevens, in a line of one of his poems, talking about the reality of the way in which the world seems to suddenly appear, he wrote, "Thou art not august until I say make it so." In Idea of Order at Key West, another one of his poems about a woman walking along an ocean side, observed by two men up on a bluff, suddenly, wide-eyed, realized what was happening as this woman sang along the seashore, and Wallace Stevens' great line saying, "She sang beside the sea, and the sea, whatever self it ever had, became the self that was her song, and she singing made." Let's take a break till next week.